On July 25th, chiefs from across Canada or their proxies will vote for National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations.
This 20-minute special will allow you to hear from each candidate vying for the top job of the AFN. It must be noted that 4 of the 5 candidates responded to our request for interviews. Candidate Katherine Whitecloud did not.
Now, we asked the same 5 questions to each of the candidates. We have drawn names out of a hat to determine the order of today's forum. We start with Myles Richardson. Mr. Richardson, what makes you the best candidate for the job of National Chief of the AFN at this moment in time?
One is my experience leading my own people, the Haida Nation, and being a leader amongst the First Nations in the northwest of British Columbia and in the province of British Columbia over the past 25 years. Secondly is my commitment to the fundamental change that we see needed in front of First Nations across this country now. And that's my commitment to establishing a proper nation-to-nation relationship between each Indigenous people, each First Nation, and the Crown of Canada. Third, and I think very importantly, is my proven leadership over the years.
Mr. Richardson, what's the top priority issue internally at the AFN that must be addressed if you are elected National Chief?
Organizing the AFN around what it's intended to be is an assembly or a circle of nations across this country. You know, the status quo in this country is the reality of the Indigenous nations that have existed in what is now Canada since time immemorial. Since Canadians have come here, there's been a number of treaties established across this country which must be honored, and there's a lot of nations out there with continuing title and rights that must be addressed. But we need to establish a new relationship with Canada that reflects the nation-to-nation nature of the original commitments and recognizes, helps, and creates a partnership in implementing our fundamental human rights, our treaty rights, and all of our rights as Indigenous people. That's the top priority issue. That's going to take a little bit of time to make that change. You know, we need a big commitment from the Government of Canada, first of all, from our own people, reflected by the Government of Canada. And in the meantime, we do need to really pay attention to keep our focus on closing the social gaps. You know, things like clean water. Everyone needs clean water. That shouldn't have to be a negotiated point. That's a fundamental human right that every Canadian should benefit from. Also, issues like our women and girls. There's no way that our women and girls should be feeling so unsafe in this country. And damn it, our leaders have to stand up and protect them and hold Canada accountable to protecting them. And those issues like that, issues like education rights, issues like health care, we have to make sure, keep the pedal to the metal and make sure that those are dealt with in the interim while we're establishing this nation-to-nation relationship, which in the long term will allow us to address our own challenges as peoples.
Myles, what changes would you like to see in how the organization function as an AFN, and how would you motivate and lead the chiefs in that new direction?
That's a really important question. And first thing people need to realize is the Assembly of First Nations is not a government. The Assembly of First Nations must not act like a government. And in many ways, that's what it's been doing, negotiating on behalf of First Nations and establishing parameters, establishing the relationship for nations with Canada without their full involvement. But the AFN does have a role in providing leadership in bringing our nations together and creating alliances from coast to coast to coast in this country on priority issues, on issues that nations identify as being most important. Providing leadership in creating space for each of our nations to do the necessary work to identify their governance institutions and their exercising their jurisdictions in a priority sense. They need to AFN needs to help to create that space through expanded fiscal relations. We need to establish right now fiscal relations between Ottawa and First Nations that are government-to-government transfers, that reflect a nation-to-nation relationship, that put accountability for the resources First Nations operate with in their own people, not in a minister in Ottawa. That's a fundamental shift in fiscal relations that must be done. And that is the nature of a nation-to-nation relationship. It's simple words to say, it's tough to do, it'll require leadership to get it done, and it's not being done now.
This is candidate Russell Daibo.
What makes you the best candidate for the job of National Chief of the AFN at this moment in time?
Well, I'm the only candidate, I think, that's calling for fundamental change. The other four candidates are basically variations on a theme of just, tinkering with the system. And pretty much I don't hear them challenging the Trudeau government and the agenda, which I think is a threat to our rights. They seem to be going along with it.
Russell, what's the top priority issue internally at the AFN that must be addressed if you are elected National Chief?
I think the threat is the Trudeau government acting unilaterally and trying to impose legislation this fall on us. They passed 10 principles on Indigenous relationships without our involvement or consent. They're basically preconditions. They're basically based on the Doctrine of Discovery. They're based on the Constitution Act 1867, which means they want to keep the federal and provincial governments, domination over the top of us. AFN's never done any analysis of those 10 principles. And they're dissolving the Department of Indian Affairs, again, without our involvement or consent. And they're creating 2 new departments. And this is all being done in secret without us, and it's going to have an impact on our rights. The Department of Indigenous Services, I call them the Department of Colonization because they're basically going to continue to implement the Indian Act. And the Crown Indigenous Relations Department is basically based on what I call termination agreements because they want to convert our pre-existing rights into new modern rights like these modern treaties and self-government agreements, which are based on a municipal model of self-government. So we haven't had a say in any of this. And now the Prime Minister announced on Valentine's Day he's going to pass a Recognition and Implementation of Rights Framework Act. And again, we had no say in any of that. And when he talks about recognizing and implementing rights, he's talking about rights that the federal government's going to define. And then they're going to use their fiscal policies to coerce us into accepting their definition of our rights. And I think that's the first priority, is to put the brakes on that, because he's trying to take our right of self-determination. We need to bring that back to the community level and the nation level from the ground up instead of this top-down secret approach he's been applying since he's formed the government in 2015.
AFN National Chief Candidate Russell Daibo joining us. Mr. Daibo, what changes would you like to see in how the organization functions? How will you motivate and lead the Chiefs in that new direction?
Well, I've heard from a lot of Chiefs already that they believe there's problems with the way that AFN does votes and the way that AFN does business. It needs to be fundamentally restructured. And they do operate under a charter. There is an AFN charter. And in that charter, it does say that if you want to change the charter, to amend it, there has to be a special assembly. And that's something I would work with Chiefs on quickly, is to develop some options for some fundamental changes to that organization to bring it back in line of being what it was intended to be, which is a lobbying and advocacy organization, not signing agreements to implement federal government legislation and policy like they've been doing now under the incumbent national chief.
What priorities should the AFN be really flexing its muscles on over the coming term and beyond?
Protecting our land rights. The Prime Minister is talking about implementing the UN Declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, but so far he's just focused on reserve programs and services and promoting a municipal model of self-government. He hasn't said anything about restoration of lands, territories, and resources, and that's in the UN Declaration. It also says that where there's not restoration of stolen lands and resources, there should be restitution. And we've never had any say in the land claims policies that Canada's been imposing since 1973. So that's another thing the UN Declaration says. There needs to be an adjudication process jointly developed. So those would be the priorities I think we need to focus on, is land Many communities need more land. They just have enough for residential purposes. They're not economically viable. So that'd be my focus.
Here is candidate Sheila North. Miss North, what makes you the best candidate for the job of National Chief?
Because right now our communities and our nations need a partner and not someone that pretends that an organization that it represents is a department of the government. We need an organization and a national chief that listens to the communities and the voices of the sovereign nations, and that's what I want to bring to the office.
What's the top priority issue internally at the AFN that must be addressed if you are elected national chief?
It needs to be restructured so that the voices of our nations and even our grassroots people are better represented at the national level. So we have to restructure the organization to see how we can do that to be better servants of our nations rather than the other way around.
Over the last couple of decades, there have been many calls for change in how the AFN operates, but no one has been able to pull the trigger on substantial renewal. What changes would you like to see in how the organization functions, and how will you motivate and lead the chiefs in a new direction?
Well, I think that the calls for changes have already been made and lots of discussion being had to see what that should look like and where it should be taken. And so I think a lot of the work is already done. It's the implementation that needs to be seriously looked at in the process, designed and created by our own people. And we have enough intelligent and strategic thinking minds from our own community that could help us with this process. But I think we have to see how our regional chiefs, for example, are what tasks they're assigned and how we can maximize their gifts and their talents to be of help to their regions. And I think we can do it more efficiently. And same with the role of the national chief. I think that we have to keep in mind that we're there as their advocates, not as their competitors to the resources that our communities need.
What government initiative should the AFN chiefs be most suspicious of, and what is the plan to guide the work or push back on that initiative?
I think we just have to remember that whatever initiatives that are being developed by the government meant for our people are that, and that we have to look further than that and beyond that and push for greater control of what happens in our communities and what programs are designed. We should be designing our own programs. There should never be anything planned about us without us.
Every national chief, no matter which political party is in power, is eventually accused of becoming too cozy with the government of Canada. Isn't the nature of the role of an advocacy organization to make friends and influence people to get things done? Why should First Nations be wary of a cozy relationship?
Well, I think there's a difference in being cozy and being a partner that adheres to, respect and good working efforts to work with non-Indigenous partners. I think sometimes we fail as the communication. We don't see what's going on. We don't hear how things are transpiring. So inevitably people become suspicious. And I think that we could do a lot more if we open up the lines of communication and even live web stream meetings so people can see how decisions and how discussions are being had. And I think that would alleviate a lot of some of the concerns that come from the communities, especially if they don't understand how the process went. So, I think we have a lot of work to do to represent our needs in our community while being partners to the rest of Canada, and doing that in a way that respects the Indigenous perspectives more. So that's where I think we have to improve is our communication.
What priorities should the AFN be really flexing its muscles on over the coming term and beyond?
Implementing the treaties. We talk about that a lot, and I know that there are regions that don't have the same number of treaties, but there are Aboriginal and Tidal, and those have to be enforced and pushed And the basis of that is the free, prior, and informed consent. I think that we have to create those processes where communities are going to their own communities to seek approval and direction, and those have to be respected.
This is candidate and incumbent Perry Bellegarde.
Mr. Bellegarde, what makes you the best candidate for the job of National Chief of the AFN at this moment in time?
What I'm hearing from the chiefs across Canada right now is the need for consistency and continuity. In the last 3-4 years, we've got some momentum going, and they want to see that maintained. So coming up in July of 24, 25, 26 Vancouver, they're looking for that consistency and continuity because there is momentum. We're starting to see some movement in the area of more investments in education, housing, and healthcare, but we still have a long way to go. We're working with the federal government on languages, revitalizing our Indigenous languages, and we hope to introduce a federal bill in the fall, working in partnership with us. You know, if we can do things in partnership with First Nations involved from start to finish on any memorandum to cabinet or any piece of legislation, we make sure that our rights and title are respected and honored, and we make sure treaty rights are at the forefront so they're protected as well. So there's momentum, and I think that's one of the most important things to carry forward.
What is the main priority internal issue at the AFN that still needs to be addressed if you are elected for a second term?
Well, again, going forward, we've got to make sure we conclude the Indigenous Languages Act. We also have to make sure that we have a strategy in place to focus on child welfare. We have 40,000 children in foster care, so that's going to be a big priority where we look at First Nations legislation and our federal legislation. We prefer to occupy the field as First Nations, and so that's going to be to exert jurisdiction, not only on reserve but off reserve for our children, to bring them home to safe homes and to safe communities. Then as well, the fiscal piece. We have some movement. We're supposed to be working towards long-term, sustainable, predictable funding, and we want to make sure that any funding we have is treaty-based. It's based on needs, based on total population, on and off the reserves, our communities, keeps up with inflation, but more importantly, to share in the land and resource wealth that we're sharing. And so that's part of the new fiscal work going forward. But more importantly, it's all about moving beyond the Indian Act, really exerting our jurisdiction as nations, and creating our own governments as nations again. And so that's the challenge going forward in the next term. And that applies to everything. When you can have First Nations jurisdiction over education and health, proper systems in place over citizenship. So that's something that we've got to keep working on.
Mr. Bellegarde, over the last couple of decades, there have been many calls for change in how the AFN operates, but no one has been able to pull the trigger on substantial renewal. What changes would you like to see in how the AFN functions, and how will you lead the Chiefs in the new direction in a second term?
Part of the work in the second term, we have to work and lobby with and advocate, for changes, for policy and legislative change for the federal governments, but as well the provinces have to change as well. And but internally within the AFN, we're guided by our charter. So updating our Assembly of First Nations charter needs to be focused on as well over the next 3 years. For example, we have to include our chiefs committees. That's how we operate. We have to respect some of our hereditary chiefs or our clan mothers. We have to look at all options for elections for national chief, from one chief to rep by pop. There's all these things. So we're going to establish a consultation process and a team to go across Canada to hear from chiefs and councils and tribal councils and PTOs about what are the issues, concerns with the AFN charter, how can we fix things, how can we make it better, and then we'll be calling a special chiefs assembly within the 2 years to make that amendment. And it's all about creating our Assembly of First Nations to be relevant for First Nations people, to be responsive to the issues, needs, and concerns identified, and to be respectful of diversity across Canada. So we've got a plan in place to get that started as well.
Okay, and final question. We have about a minute left. What priorities should the AFN be really flexing its muscles on over the coming term and beyond?
I think it's all about respecting First Nations rights and title and getting all governments, federal, provincial, municipal, to respect inherent rights, Aboriginal rights and title and jurisdiction, and treaty rights. That's always got to be the place. We've got federal governments, provincial governments, but you also have First Nations government. And it's not only just common law and civil law that should be respected in Canada, but First Nations law, natural law, or creators law. And so there has to be space for that to be reflected in the makeup going forward. And it's really all about respecting the diversity, because we're trying to build a better country. We've suffered the effects of the residential schools, no question, the genocide. We've suffered the colonial impacts and control of the Indian Act. But we've got to move beyond those things now and start reconstituting ourselves as nations and build a better country for all of us, for your children, for my children, our grandchildren. And that's the next 150 years where we embrace diversity, mutually benefit from sharing the land and resource wealth, and make the space to build a better country for all of us. So that's the challenge going forward.
We thank the 2018 AFN National Chief candidates for joining us. For more insight into the AFN National Chief platforms, visit windspeaker.com.